Yeah, I'm going to try to be brief because I'd love to chat with you about this general subject. I wrote a book called The Next Convergence. It's based on the work I've been doing for the last 7 or 8 years. I can give you the flavor of it. It involves the developing world and the emerging economies. I chaired a commission on growth and development, was populated by political and policy leaders, not academics like me, who had, fought the battles and won and lost and been the agents of change and accelerating growth in the developing world. And I learned a ton from them and have been involved in lots of different countries, Brazil, China, and India, trying to be helpful, trying to bring international experience into, all the complicated policy decisions that they try to make to deal with accelerating growth and poverty reduction. And so I thought at some point, for a reason I'll mention in a minute, that was a good time to write a book about growth in the emerging markets. And I guess the reason I thought that is that we are at a kind of crossroads. We're within 10 years of having the so-called emerging economies. Jim O'Neill, who invented the term BRICS, is at Goldman Sachs, has announced we're not allowed to use the term emerging anymore because they've emerged. And so now we're fishing around for another term. So I'll use emerging for now. They're going to be more than half the global economy. And I'll give you some other data, but this is the point in history in which the emerging economies are becoming systemically important, and that has all kinds of implications. The way I framed the book is I went back with the help of Angus Maddison, who's the best-known economic historian, and way, way back to the year 1000. And what you do, if you do that, what you notice is that for about 8 centuries, there was almost no growth in the world. Countries were rather similar. Most of the people were poor and lived in agricultural environments at a subsistence basis. There were a few wealthy people who also had power. And if you compared countries and asked yourself how different were they, the answer was not much. In the Ming Dynasty, China was slightly richer than Europe. And then that all changed with the British Industrial Revolution. And at that point, income started to rise. You had real growth. It wasn't breathtaking by our standards. Welcome. It was like 1.5% a year in real terms. And that British Industrial Revolution spilled over into continental Europe and into what Angus Maddison calls the European offshoots. That would be us and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. And we grew at a breathtaking pace of 2.5%. And this went on for 200 years. And at the end of that 200 years, the 15% of the world's population that lives in what we now call advanced countries had incomes and wealth that were on the order of 40 to 50 times what everybody else had, the other 85%, because for lots of reasons they didn't participate in this. And then after World War II, a bunch of very wise people, with the United States the dominant sort of survivor of that event, decided that they would not reproduce the sort of disastrous policies that followed World War I, where the vanquished were supposed to be crushed, and that led essentially to a depression in World War II. They did something different. They decided they would rebuild the vanquished economies in Europe and Japan, open the global economy, and then with a huge tailwind from technology, what amounts to what you do, this global economy turned into an opportunity. And so what the book is about is this century that we began after World War II, in which I believe what we're in process of seeing is the expansion of the people who live in high-income countries with the kinds of opportunities and so on that we have, expanding from 15% of the world's population to something like 80% and maybe more if things go well in certain parts of the developing world. And so the book I've written is an attempt in the first part to explain that evolution. This doesn't happen very often in the history of the world. I thought it might be kind of interesting. And then I focus on how this high-speed growth that we've seen actually occurs. So if you look at the developing world in the period since World War II, you discover there's 13 economies that have managed to sustain growth rates of 7% or more for 25 years or more. Now that's the kind of thing, if it's sustained, that changes economies and people's lives, because if you're growing at 10%, which is roughly where China's been recently, you're doubling every 7 years. Means in a 30-year period, you're 16 times as well off as you were before, unless you have an awful lot of population growth. I won't spend a lot of time this morning, but I get asked by investors and other people a lot who are interested in, well, they're growing fast, can they keep this up? Are they driving toward a brick wall and so on? And the only way to answer that is to try to understand both the policies and the economic dynamics that work. The economic dynamics are not mysterious. They're sort of a version of what Hal described a minute ago. It's Schumpeter's creative destruction. But the key element in the global economy that's enabled this growth is its openness, and that causes, if you think of this 200 years of divergence, followed by this converging pattern for a century, the gap in terms of the knowledge and technology base of these economies was enormous, the advanced versus developing. And what's happening is that the technology that's been developed over these 200 years is and continues to be developed, is rapidly imported, essentially, through multiple channels into emerging economies. And so the potential of the economy to produce output of a variety of kinds grows enormously. So that's the key. Growth is really about knowledge and knowledge transfer, is what it comes down to. And you all and others have made this easier. The second critical component that goes with this kind of high-speed growth is the global economy's size and demand. I think the easiest way to see it is, in a poor country, no matter how many people there are, if the per capita income is $500, the economy is small. And if you look at the demand side, of the economy, it's not just small, but its composition is uninteresting from the point of view of specialization and exporting things. In a very poor country, the lion's share of income and output is devoted to food, shelter, energy. Once you've added up those two things, there's not a whole lot left. So you can't grow an economy by trying to produce for that economy alone. Then you switch over to the global economy, and if you're a small country and you found something where you can compete, what economists call comparative advantage, and you have a sort of 2% market share, and you miraculously grow by 50%, then you have a 3% market share in the global economy. So you can't impact the global economy. The way that impact would show up in an economic model is you would start to affect the prices, and you would turn the terms of trade against yourself. That basically doesn't happen. And so the third component, since you have this almost unlimited, think of it as infinite market to sell into, then basically you can grow as fast as you can invest. And high-speed growth of this type requires investment rates as a fraction of GDP of about 25 to 30%. So if an economy falls short of that, then they will slow down. You just can't, the capital output ratios in economies are 2.5 to 3. You've got to get the investment rate up or you can't keep the growth. When you're poor, that's very hard. Part of that, probably 5 to 7%, is public sector investment in education and infrastructure. And most economies, find it difficult to do that for the understandable reason that if somebody comes along and says, I've got a great deal for you, okay? Your household income is $500 a year. You're not going to spend a third of it. We're going to invest it so that your children and grandchildren are better off. It's an amazing intertemporal choice that gets made, and in some countries, they manage to make it. The other thing I guess I wanted to report to you on this front is that when I started this, I thought this was mostly about sort of fairly complicated high-speed dynamics, economic dynamics. Now I think it's a lot about leadership and politics and so on. So if you look at the cases where economies grow and succeed, you can usually find leadership in the form of bringing people together, leadership in the form of picking the right model. The institutions aren't there to kind of help do this in the early stages of growth. We looked at the 13 high-growth economies and said, What do they have in common? They have certain economic ingredients in common. What they don't have in common is governance, in the form of governance. So if you have India, which is about to join the group, China, a very different system, Botswana, a tiny little democracy that's succeeding, landlocked somewhere in southern Africa. And if you look at the countries that are struggling, you can find failing democracies, with pathologies like vote buying and, chasing after natural resources, the kind of things that Paul Collier describes so well. And then you can find autocratic systems that fail. So, you're all quantitatively oriented. If you have a 2x2 box with high and low economic performance and, somewhere between democratic and autocratic on the other dimension, you can fill in all the boxes. And so I think the correct conclusion is it's not the form of governance that matters. And it turns out what it does matter is making correct choices, but more importantly, and long time horizons, but intending to benefit all the people in the economy. I will now undercut myself. Economists are lousy forecasters. And so you shouldn't believe anything I say about the future. In the 1950s and 60s, development economists, the leading people in the field, were asked, how is the developing world going to go? And for the most part, they said that Africa would be the star performer and Asia would be the basket case. That's about as close to dead wrong as you can get, I think. And the reason, but the more interesting thing is the reason they said that. They said it because we believed incorrectly that enduring wealth and value creation depended on natural resources in the developing world and not on people. Africa is way more wealthy in terms of natural resources than any other part of the world. And Asia isn't. So in Asia, and Asia was the poorest part of the world in 1950 by some fairly large amount. And basically people looked around and said, well, what have we got here? And the answer was, we've got people, they can be educated, and we can turn loose this thing. And now we have completely different conception of what sustained growth and, sort of well-being is based on. Last part of the book, I sort of turn my attention to the future because, as I said a minute ago, this is sort of a crossroads. And you have the developing economies becoming large and having systemic impacts. And there's all kinds of dimensions of this. There's natural resources and the environment and sustainability. We talk a lot about that, but this is serious. A reasonably conservative estimate is the global economy measured in terms of GDP, which is somewhere between $55 and $60 trillion, and big enough to cause worries about whether, the planet we live on will sustain this, is set to at least triple in the next 20 years. To something on the order of 160 or sort of, and that's not the end of the growth. So there are real questions about this, and I'll say a word about the Asian view of this in a minute. There's questions of stability and governance. For most of the period that we've been involved in up till now, developing economies could focus more or less intensively on the complicated domestic job of growth and development. And they had external effects. The policies that were adopted had external effects, but they weren't big enough to cause a major problem in the global economy. But at a certain scale, this is no longer true. One of the things I had to do is teach myself to think about size as distinct from growth. So 20 years ago, China started growing in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping decided with his colleagues that they were going to do something different. And they set off on a pretty intelligent market-oriented growth path, freed up agriculture to sell at market prices and so on. And after 10 years, the economy was growing at a nice pace, 9 or 10%. But if you ask what was the increment to the global economy, at that point, the answer was relatively very small, in fact, notwithstanding the numbers of people, 1.3 billion. Fast forward another 21 years, and they've been at this 31 years, and they have the second largest economy in the world. And when China grows at 10%, it is a major event in the global economy. And so, I mean, that's just an illustration of this point that China is now in a very, very complex set of transitions that are important to everybody. It is the engine of growth not just for itself and a good chunk of the global economy, but virtually all of the emerging economies. The major export destination for Brazil, India, Korea, and a long list of countries is China. So if we were 10 years ago and investors thinking about what does the developing world depend on, it would be our growth, America and Europe. Now the answer is they're kind of a little bit independent of us, not completely. If we take a nosedive, that will hurt them, but they're really dependent on the Chinese growth. So a lot is riding on what's going on in China. China's in the middle income, what's called the middle income transition. This is a term you may not have heard. It's the phase of growth that comes at about $4,000 or $5,000 to $10,000 of per capita income. And the reason it's so interesting and treacherous is that the engines of growth that have been running in the export sector, labor-intensive, process-oriented manufacturing and some services, aren't competitive anymore. And so Schumpeter's creative destruction, which is mostly creation and diversification of the economy, which occurs for the first 20 years or so, sort of gets added to by having the destruction come into the model as well. And there's a very, very strong tendency to resist that change. I remember being in Korea in the 1980s. Korea was one of the more effective high-speed transitions through the middle income. And the journalists came rushing up and said, the wages are going up. And I said, yep, that's good. And they said, and we're becoming uncompetitive in this high-quality, low-cost manufacturing. And I said, yep. And they said, well, then we have to hold the wages down. I said, oh, wait a minute. I thought the whole purpose of this exercise was to have incomes and so on go up. And they said, well, that's true. And what people find very difficult to understand is that growth in this sense and structural change are basically the same thing. And you can't halt the structural change without halting the growth process. And so you have to, and in the middle income transition, domestic demand becomes more important. The market decides more and the government decides less. It's more hands-off. It's more like an advanced economy. Innovation becomes more important than it is in the early stages where you're mostly importing technology. Unless this sounds sort of theoretical, if you take those 13 economies, you'll find them in the book and in the Growth Commission report. Only 5 managed to sustain high growth through the middle income transition, and everybody else stalled out or slowed down dramatically or even worse. In the case of Brazil, which was an early high growth country, in the mid-70s it literally stopped. Became a dictatorship, had several rounds of hyperinflation, turned inward, all kinds of things went wrong. Those 5 countries are Japan, Korea, Taiwan. I guess you'd think of Taiwan as an economy now, not a country. Hong Kong, also part of China now, and Singapore. So it's treacherous and it's not a done deal. I have found it interesting, and I tried to share some of it in the book, trying to help the Chinese government think through the policies that are associated with this transition, and they're pretty well embedded in what was just passed. It's called the 12th Five-Year Plan in China. So let me close on the sort of environmental and natural resources front with something I learned since I wrote the book. If you look at Asia, it's 3.8 billion people, east and south, and about 60% of the world's population, slightly less. In absolute terms, most of the growth in the global economy I adverted to a minute ago is going to occur in Asia. Because it's high growth. It contains the 2 future economic giants, China and India, assuming nothing goes wrong with the growth process. We're talking decades-long processes, but they're well on the way. And so when they confront the question of whether or not the growth model that we used to achieve our current status and that all their predecessors used in getting to be where Korea is or Taiwan is or and so on, and ask themselves the question, can we just use that growth model to complete the journey in the rest of this century so that we're in this category living the way we do? The answer they come up with is probably not. That it just doesn't scale. That you cannot run economies, with 85% of the world's population living the way we do at energy intensities and so on. And so they are going to set off on a course to try to reinvent, at least at the margin, the growth model so it is sustainable in this dimension. And this is new. I mean, I think we haven't confronted this question before, but what's interesting about it is this isn't a global issue for them. This is a long-term growth strategy issue. That it's a question of their own success, with China in the lead. But if China and India at their scale, 40% of the world's population in 2 countries, internalize this, the rest of Asia will, and it'll completely change the dynamics of the global economy in the next 30, 40 years. And I expect Asia actually to be increasingly, because of the incentives, to be in a leadership role in driving toward less impactful growth paths than we've had before. In Asia, for those of you who know it well, you'll recognize that when they talking about this, they start talking about lifestyles. For a Westerner, when you hear the term lifestyle, you think, gee, what are you talking about? Lifestyles for us are the choices you make. A Google T-shirt, sandals, Spence in a suit, in this huge territory that we have allocated to individual choice and freedom. And then there's another subset of stuff we acknowledge where our choices are constrained. But by and large, we think that second class should be as small as possible, and this should be huge. What they mean by lifestyles is not what we mean. It's not this sort of funny little stuff in the big territory. It means how we go forward. It means how cities are built, and whether you can drive a car. It even means how many kids you can have. Because these all have very large external effects if people are just making their own choices. And because there's so many people involved and lying behind it, the sustainable question, the Asian countries do and will continue to just draw and redraw that line in different places. And this causes tremendous communication problems, because this idea that this belongs sort of constitutionally in the area of sort of free choice is an idea that's deeply embedded here and not the same concept as there. So when you hear talk about lifestyles, you're really hearing talk about sustainability, something that actually works when you scale it up. I'll conclude by saying I find China fascinating. Its per capita income is $4,000. It's very pragmatic. The highest speed learning environment I've ever been in terms of picking stuff up, is quite amazing to watch. But China is the only country ever at $4,000 of per capita income, which is less than a tenth of ours, to have systemically important effects on the rest of the global economy. It's just never happened before. Most countries that become, like Japan, that become systemically important get there at something like 4 or 5 times that level of per capita income. So there's a very big challenge in China. It's sort of a tension. There's a subset of people who say, look, we haven't really completed this journey yet, and we're going to focus on our domestic growth and development agenda. And there's another set of people, both internally and externally, and this second set is right, who are saying, no, you can't do that. It's sort of too bad that you've reached this point where you have to balance global stability and other issues, in the policies you adopt with the domestic growth and development agenda, but it's not in your interest to ignore these set of external effects. And so we're entering a world in which the emerging economies are going to be part of the governance of the global economy in the context of the G20. The G20 is going to have to learn how to be effective, or we're going to have a long period of unmanaged and unregulated growth and interaction in the global economy. And I think actually that's inevitable. The kinds of shocks and things that we're starting to experience now, I think are going to be a regular feature of the global economy for some time, because the sort of governing it, with the starting point being national identities and national decision-making units, is just not going to happen overnight. In fact, I think it's probably the work of a generation. The only thing I regret is that I probably will not see the end of the century I've just written about. Maybe if I get lucky, I'll see most of it. But if you stand back from it, this is pretty extraordinary phenomenon, and where so many people's opportunities to be productive and creative are expanding so fast that it's pretty exciting just to see part of it. Well, let me stop there and turn it over to you. I've decided the dog can ask the first question. That's right, food. This is great.
So let me ask you an economic history question.
Sure.
Jumped over that.
I did.
So everybody agrees, yes, the industrial change is basically zero change for years. And then back in remarkable change. Permeated England and Europe. But what do you think the reasons are that it didn't impact the rest of the world? Or that the rest of the world did not get this same growth spurt that came from
This won't be a complete answer, Hal, but surely there were asymmetries built into the colonial structures that were I think it's reasonable to guess, without being a thoroughly trained economic historian, were the main reason why developing countries, what we call developing countries, were parts of large colonial empires, and their role was simply to supply natural resources and absorb a very small amount of sort of output, and that was imposed pretty rigidly. And where it broke in the American case by having a continent that wasn't pre-populated, so that it was, but we didn't treat them very well. And basically it became a European offshoot, as Angus Madison says, and then broke free and then sort of joined the party. But in most of the world that didn't happen. So the collapse of the colonial empires after World War II, of their own weight, was probably the major factor in freeing this thing up. And then you got the opening of the global economy. And that took time. I mean, it took, Barry Bosworth and others who have studied this, the opening, it's fun to go back and look at the GATT and the steps in the GATT and see what was opened when. But manufacturing wasn't the first step. And that's the territory where they found the chance to grow and create a modern economy. Yes, sir.
You can just repeat the question.
Yeah, no, loud as you can.
What's your point of view on political stability? We look at Peru and China and also Argentina. They all went through their, dictatorship and authoritarian governments, and then those are periods actually the country were growing really fast and well.
Yeah.
So what's your take on these things?
Yeah. So the question is, you have countries that have been relatively authoritarian in varying dimensions and growing fast. What's my take on all of that? Let me preface this by saying I think there is a body of work led by, young colleagues of Hal's and mine in the area of political economy that's really terribly important and making progress in understanding the interactions of sort of economic processes and political and governance processes. And I think it's made significant progress and will have at least another 10 years. Having said that, let me do the best I can with it. There are people who believe, I think correctly, that if you have a benign authoritarian enterprise that's also competent, meaning they know what they're doing and their intentions are good, they can move more quickly. And so the fact that China, once it changed direction, could move very quickly to a set of policies that supported 9 to 10% growth, whereas India, probably the world's most complicated democracy, is getting there, but it's just harder, in that political system to get there. And so you can say that. On the other hand, most people believe, and I think this is also true, that the cost of democratic processes, which is it's harder to make changes, is also a benefit, because if you're going in the wrong direction, there are more brakes that stop you. It's safer. Amartya Sen says you don't have many famines. I think he says any in a democratic environment. And so if you have a non-benign inclination in the part of people who are currently in power, democracy has a better chance of getting them out, if it's working. Then you go around and look and discover that there are democracies that aren't working. A number of the Asian countries that are now in the advanced income category, including Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, were relatively autocratic in the sense that they had dominant single parties, and the structure was put together to keep them that way. And they've all evolved, somewhere between middle and high income into full multi-party democracies. I was in Singapore 2 weeks ago. They had their first, it was hilarious. I called it, political campaigning kindergarten. But they had their first real campaign. And the people, friends of mine in the dominant party, were kind of nervous, and a little bit upset, that somebody would actually stand up and criticize them. So they may be in this transition as well. It's too soon to tell. But I think that's kind of where we are. The way I said it when I was talking is that I think the thing that you can be sure of is that the form is not the decisive factor. And then you can get on to thinking about benefits and costs. It's surely true that China is pragmatic and moves with incredible speed. And you have to. At 10% growth, you wake up in the morning and discover that there isn't enough electric power, and there's 120 ships outside the port in Shanghai where you don't have any way to process them. And you can't avoid that. They're just bottlenecks all the time. So you have to just move fast and deal with it. The other thing that China's done, I think you all probably know, the investment rate in China, when it started growing fast, jumped to 35%. So that was the upper end of the known range. It's now at 45%. And the savings rate's over half of the GDP. These are completely on the right tail of the distribution. Not always a good thing, but China uniquely has been able to build infrastructure to support the growth, even in advance of the need, like the high-speed trains, with a kind of public sector balance sheet that's big enough to do it, whereas most countries struggle to get the investment levels up. So China's unique in that respect. Yeah.
You mentioned Korea's wages going too high to maintain competitiveness with factory work and labor. Do you see, just with the sheer size of the population, do you see them having that same problem today? Where would you imagine factory labor would go at that point, or is it just skipping out the problems?
Yeah, I do. So this is actually a very important question that scares the Chinese as well as puzzles outsiders. We got in the habit in small economies of thinking that the export sector drove growth and the labor-intensive part was where you had a comparative advantage. And that's how you got all those people in the agricultural sector into cities in the modern economy. I didn't say it, but urbanization occurs at a tremendous pace in the course of this. In China and India, as long as the growth stays up, and there's still, in the case of China, 50+% in the agricultural sector. In the case of India, it's closer to 70%. They'll basically have to build Los Angeles every year for the next 30 or 40 years, each of them, not together. Sort of 13 to 15 million people flowing in, not a big fraction of the population. And so that whole process goes on. Now China, so what worries people in China is the coastal wages started to rise, very rapidly last summer, after the Foxconn suicides and the strikes in the Honda plants and so on. And of course, they were waiting for this. They want the household income to rise. So this is a big tailwind in speeding up the creation of the middle class. But then somebody sticks up their hand and says, well, what about the people who are still on the lower end of the skill and education spectrum in the rural areas? If they can't get into the labor-intensive export sector because it's moved on up the value-added chain, where are they going to go? And you have to have an answer to that. You need an employment engine running. And the answer probably is the urbanization process will create gigantic urban service sectors. And so the urban service sectors will be the avenue into the modern economy that formerly was provided almost entirely by the export sector. And if that engine fails, then this whole process will stall, and it will create a kind of dual economy structure of the type that you see in parts of Latin America. And Brazil is doing very well now, but what happened in Brazil is that, first of all, unlike China and much of the rest of the developing world, in Latin America and parts of Africa, there was never any reform in the ownership of assets, particularly land. So there's very, very concentrated ownership of assets, which allows you in the agricultural sector to do land, you don't have to do land consolidation, you can mechanize it. So in Brazil, agriculture became modern and capital intensive, and the people weren't needed. So they went to the cities not for opportunity, but for lack of opportunity where they were. And in Brazil, they ended up living in little tin cans up on the sides of hills called favelas. That's the wrong kind of urbanization. That's the kind of urbanization that scares the wits out of the Chinese because of the numbers of people involved. And so the only way to make a process that's always somewhat chaotic a little healthier is to have it driven by the pull of employment opportunity rather than the push of absence of opportunity in there. And so this service sector is going to be the employment destination for the remainder of the people in the. The other thing that will happen is they will keep the labor-intensive parts of the export sector alive a little longer by building enough infrastructure that it can move inland, where the country is not as rich as it is on the coast. So basically what you're going to see simultaneously in the next 10 years is the labor-intensive activities are going to move to other countries, probably Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, and so on. They'll move inland and they'll move up and down the coast a little bit. The companies a lot of them will move with them. We saw that in the case of Korea. I tracked the Nike supply chain over a lot of years because I used to be on the board. Started in Japan. It's almost unimaginable now. Japan moved on, and it moved to Korea and Taiwan, almost unimaginable now. And then it moved to China, and then Vietnam and Indonesia, which had a bad patch in the 97-98 crisis. And I say this because when you watch the global economy, it's just constantly in motion. And the architects of these global supply chains are multinational companies like this one. This is who decides where the opportunities lie in terms of the supply chain and the match to markets. But I think that's the answer. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I would like to have your take on the growth in Western Asia and North Central Asia, especially the Middle East, and resource-rich economies, and your comments on what some people call the curse of natural resources, which is going to generate growth, but in a competitive fashion and not benefiting the entire society. And where do you think that part of the world is going?
Well, first of all, there's a high correlation between natural resource wealth and failures of governance. It's well documented by lots of people, including Paul Collier in Africa, which is his focus. So it's while I think that economic sort of theory and analysis will catch up with this, I mean, natural resource wealth tends to distort political incentives to the zero-sum game version, where you get your hands on the wealth and that's good enough, as opposed to there's not much here, we better make it bigger, which is where the growth orientation comes from. There's a fairly significant set of initiatives underway to help countries manage natural resource wealth, even if they get by the sort of, we're going to fight over it kind of version of it. One of which is led by Paul and a number of other people, and I'm involved in, called the Natural Resource Charter. So even if your intentions are good, it's pretty hard to get this done. And you have to sort of take the natural resource wealth, invest a chunk of it outside so you don't so your exchange rate doesn't put you out of the market, the so-called Dutch disease effect. And then you have to take the remainder and build enough infrastructure and spend it on the public sector, investment portfolio that drives growth, doesn't drive growth. It enables the private sector engine to start running. And lots of countries just don't know how to do that. They don't have the human resources to do that. And so you go look at what happens, and the procurement fails and the infrastructure construction is bad. One of the reasons the Chinese are now the largest investor in Africa is they're making deals with African countries in which they basically have access to the natural resources which they and others need, and in return they'll apply the expertise they've acquired to sort of building infrastructure. So this is, I talk about it in the book, on the scale of things, this is a reasonably important set of problems, especially for the subset of countries. Now in the Middle East, the management has gotten better over time, but the problem, I think, in the Middle East, well, this is sort of too simple. We could spend the afternoon on the Middle East. I believe a very important, reason for the recent, sort of revolts is that these economies were proceeding in a way in which young people had very little future. And they finally said enough. The youth unemployment problem is fairly large in certain parts of the world, but it's gigantic through most of the Middle East. How this is going to come out, I think is honesty compels one to say we don't know. It could come out very well with different governance structures and agendas. I spent quite a lot of time in Egypt. Egypt has been moving in the right direction, but too slowly. It was an economy dominated by the government, where young people went to university, and if you asked, what are you studying? They said, anything that'll get me a government job eventually. You don't run a high-speed growth economy with people investing in their ability to track down a government job. And they just weren't unwinding this fast enough, and the dynamism that we talked about a few moments ago just didn't start running, and eventually the young people sort of said, there's not enough opportunity here. Among them women, where there was prominently a huge non-amount of opportunity. I'm hoping this comes out well. That is, that they get back on track with governance systems that are stable, but you'd have to say that's not a done deal yet. Yes, sir.
What's your take on growth and the distribution of the income? Because different countries clearly have it in different points of the scale, and there is an insight on.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief on that. The Growth Commission said, and the members of it believed, that paying attention to what the Indians call inclusive growth, which is equality of opportunity, not blocking people out, managing the degree of inequality and the outcomes in terms of incomes and access to resources, and protecting people through the transitions that occur in this kind of high-speed structural change, that's an inherent part of a successful growth strategy. It's not an add-on. And if you lose control of it or fail to pay attention to it, with a very high probability you will fail. And I don't think there are any exceptions to that. Now, having said that, if everybody's poor and you start growing, everybody doesn't increase at the same time. So measured income inequality goes up, but if it goes up enough, it gets to be a problem. I would say China and the United States are at the margin with Gini coefficients of somewhere between 0.4 and 0.45. That's just the standard measure of income inequality. If it's 1, one person has all the income, and if it's 0, we're all equal. There are a collection of countries that have higher Gini coefficients, and they're in Latin America and Africa for the reasons that we talked about in relation to land. And that causes big problems. You have high Gini coefficients like that with concentrated, income and ownership of assets, they control the political process for a while, and then people get fed up, and you get a populist revolt, and the pendulum swings a long way. And then usually economic and other policies are adopted that don't work, and there's a kind of crisis of some kind, and then there's a swing back. And this pendulum swing back from populism to whatever the special interests of the dominant wealth are doesn't do anything good for growth. I mean, that would be, I think, on the political economy side, an important factor in the struggles that have occurred in Latin America to get things going. The bottom line is you have to pay attention. Can I do a little advertising? After I wrote the book, I started to decide to pay attention to the distributional effects of globalization in the advanced countries, and wrote a paper with Sandile Halachuayo that you can find on the Council on Foreign Relations website. That's about the structure of the American economy and its evolution. And it's a little worrying. I mean, I'll give you one line from it in the hope that it might interest you. I don't have time this morning but I think we're at this crossroads where these effects are big. So if you look at the American economy in the 20 years, roughly, coming into the start of the crisis, and ask where did the employment come from? The answer is we created 27 million jobs, and almost all of those, 98% net, meaning netting, Google puts people out of business. We have job destruction, job creation all the time, but so these are net increments by industry sector. If you take the United States economy and divide it into tradable, goods and services that you can trade internationally, where you all live, and non-tradable, government, healthcare, construction, I mean, you guys are making the tradable sector bigger, and that's nice, but that's going to take time. 98% of the incremental employment in the United States economy was in the non-tradable sector. The tradable sector didn't employ any incremental people. It did fine in value added, and highly educated people came in and did very well. And as the global economy gets bigger and there's all kinds of growth out there, it's a pretty fun place to play. But that's not where the middle class is employed. Okay? So within our own country, the distributional effects or the impacts of globalization and technology are very different at different levels in the income and educational hierarchy. And I think it's a major problem for us. In fact, it's a miracle that we didn't have an employment problem before. If we hadn't had excess consumption, huge growth in healthcare and substantial growth in government, we probably would have had an employment problem before the crisis. Anyway, there's all kinds of dimensions to this, and I think we should pay attention. My next project is going to go look at the reforms Germany undertook in the last 10 years, because they're performing very, very differently from us right now. And then sort of try to triangulate. I think I'm going to collaborate also with the McKinsey Global Institute on sort of trying to figure out for all the major economies in the world where we are and where we've been in terms of their structural evolution. As I think bottom line is we're missing a complete picture of the structure of the global economy, and we need to do it dynamically and trying to figure out what's going on.
I've got time for just one more question.
Okay.
So it's good to talk about India and China, but I think most of the world has smaller countries, right? So they would look up to examples which are smaller in nature but are functional democracies, but poor, just like them. So would you consider countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Chile as good examples which are functional democracies but poor right now, but good in the right direction?
You got to do it case by case. So Chile is functioning very well. Its growth is a little bit lower than they'd ideally like because they periodically run into the natural resource curse with copper being the driving force. But by and large, it's extremely well managed. It's democratic now, and it looks like it's an important case. It's not as important as Brazil because of the scale and so on. Sri Lanka, what can I say? Jury's out, I guess. It's not been particularly a high performer yet, But if they have some version of the internal conflict taken care of, then it could easily, and especially, the big economies matter because they expand the opportunity set for others. So if you get Egypt in North Africa, Brazil in South America, India in South Asia, and then China in Asia, going in the right direction, the spillover effects in other countries will be very large. If you look at the G20 is more than 85% of the global GDP, and it's 66% of the world's population. So if you stop paying attention to the high growth cases and flip it over, then you've basically got a third of the world's population with all of the low growth and thus far non-performing sort of parts of the world. Not all, but a fairly large fraction. And probably somewhere around 12% of global GDP. So the question mark at the end of this century is, will that rather substantial number of people and huge number of countries, I mean, there's probably 180, 190 countries in the world. The G20 is, even if you add all the ones in Europe together, because Europe's in the G20 all as a unit, as well as a few countries. But I guess the central question that we don't know the answer to is, are they late starters but in the process of joining the party or not? And we won't know the answer to that for another 10 years. I think the signs are good. I mean, I'm an optimist about Africa. I think the leadership is young, smart, and responsible in the sense of taking ownership. They stand up and say clearly to their fellow citizens and others, this is our thing. We got to solve this problem and we're going to do it. They've built from very tough starting points a sense of national identity, which is just the rock bottom foundation. They were handed a bunch of countries that made absolutely no sense, that were just boundaries with several tribes in them, and great leadership and other things have allowed them to pull it together. I mean, people like Nyerere and Mandela and others, and I think the growth shows it. It's accelerated. They've even come through the crisis pretty well.
Another round of applause for Michael Spence.
Thank you very much. Fun being with you.